Les doy la hora. 7 de la mañana, Chihuahua. 7 de la mañana, 19 minutos 42 segundos, tiempo del centro de México. Sigue temblando un poquitito, pero pues vamos a tomarlo con una gran tranquilidad. Vamos a esperar un segundo para poder hablar.
On September 19, 1985, an 8.1 magnitude earthquake occurred off the Pacific coast of Mexico. While some damage was reported near the epicenter of the quake, Mexico City, situated 350 kilometers to the east, was devastated. The city of 18 million people shook for over 4 minutes, and an estimated 9,000 people lost their lives. 30,000 were injured, and 50,000 people were left homeless. Over 3,000 buildings were destroyed, and in all, damage estimates exceeded $4 billion. The earthquake was the second largest in Mexico in the 20th century, and the level of energy release was unusually high. As expected, ground motion decreased with distance and dropped to harmless levels upon reaching rock sites near Mexico City, but certain vibrational frequencies were greatly amplified by the soft sediments of the lake bed in the Valley of Mexico. The worst damage occurred to structures with resonant frequencies close to those generated by the earthquake. The level of damage caused by the 1985 quake had never been observed at locations over 300 kilometers from an epicenter. However, the Mexico City Building Code predicted seismic wave amplifications in the lake zone because of the clay content of the region, but despite all predictions, the resulting damage exceeded all expectations. The medical service network in place at the time was prepared and equipped to deal with the thousands of injuries, but the number of firemen and emergency responders was far too small to deal with the scope of the catastrophe. A national disaster emergency plan was in place in 1985, but President de Madrid did not initiate the operation because he feared military control and a loss of political support. Initial rescue responses were haphazard. Governmental institutions were ineffective. The public had to depend on themselves. The earthquake caused the failure of the 12-story reinforced concrete structure housing the Ministry of Communications and Transport and the nation's main microwave transmitter. This precipitated a near total loss of long-distance communication between Mexico City and the rest of the world. for several weeks, the main communication to the outside world was provided by amateur radio operators, not the authorities. Ordinary citizens spontaneously organized brigades to help in the rescue effort and to provide food, clothing, and emotional support to the homeless. The rapid response must have been a manifestation of the extraordinary solidarity of the Mexican population. In order to help those left homeless, community organizations arose around and united with the National Union of Seamstresses to form the CUD, Coordinator of the Victims. Community groups like the CUD met with governmental organizations to push for housing for the homeless. Initial government response was to insist the community movements join the PRE before gaining concessions. Community groups resisted and pushed for their core demands, including their active participation in the Reconstruction Project. As of 1999 and 2005, there are reports of people still living in temporary camps awaiting rehousing. Other examples of Mexicans helping themselves in the face of ineffective government efforts were to be seen around the city. Groups of youths crawled into collapsed buildings to look for survivors. Without training, equipment, or any experience in rescue efforts, these youths were instrumental in the rescue efforts which pulled 191 survivors from Juarez Hospital. They earned the nickname Los Topos, the Moles. Los Topos banded together to create Brigada de Topos de Tlatelolco. Los Topos are affiliated with the Civil Protection Committee and are internationally recognized rescue experts. With their scent dogs, they have helped around the world when disaster strikes, including New York on 9/11, the Haiti 2010 earthquake, the Indonesian tsunami, and La Aquila in Italy. At the time of the quake, the PRE had been in power for 56 years. Single-party politics and regrettable policy decisions had reinforced inefficient systems largely driven by corruption and greed. Beginning in 1940, the government borrowed heavily to finance rapid industrial growth in order to create domestic manufacturing capabilities to replace many imports. By 1972, facing social unrest, the state had adopted policies to both drive industrialization and redistribute economic gains across groups. This was accomplished by disregarding monetary and financial stability and by borrowing from international lenders to refinance the long-term, deep deficits necessary to drive both policies. In the short term, strong profits from oil exports, unprecedented global oil prices, and plentiful loans were sufficient to drive growth and fund the country's debt service. Mexico's social and industrial policies resulted in structural problems that limited the efficacy of the state, while the de facto single-party system and lack of democratic competition created institutional problems that precluded its ability to remedy structural inadequacies. Symptoms of these problems included massive debts, ongoing deficits, uncontrolled inflation, overvalued currency, and inefficient markets, leaving the economy and country in peril. When oil prices plummeted and the U.S. dollar strengthened, the Mexican economy collapsed. Investors and their capital fled, and the peso underwent massive devaluations. Mexico was left incapable of servicing its debts, resulting in a financial crisis, a sovereign debt default, uncontrollable inflation, and falling wages. A conditional IMF loan and stabilization plan managed to slow the economic collapse, but the plan also crippled the central government's capacity to respond to even the most basic societal needs, much less to a natural disaster. The IMF stabilization plan called for deficits to be slashed, wage increases to be capped, peso devaluations, and trade liberalization that would open weak domestic markets to strong international competition. Mexico addressed all of the targets of the IMF's plan simultaneously and aggressively without policies to limit the harm. The price of state-controlled utilities skyrocketed, unemployment soared, real wages plummeted, and public investment in food subsidies disappeared. The government had all but eliminated itself. By the early 1980s, frustration with the PRI had resulted in a series of mayoral victories by the PAN in the north, and the PRI began to utilize widespread election fraud, included ballot stuffing and voter intimidation to maintain its power. Rather than denying the use of such tactics, a PRI official commented that, quote, "We are doing these people a favor. If they knew what the PAN really stood for, they wouldn't vote for them," end quote. In the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, the government deployed approximately 1,800 soldiers to prevent looting and enforce a nighttime curfew. The soldiers were soon overworked and overwhelmed, so an additional 1,500 conscripts were sent in as reinforcements. In his first public statement following the disaster, President de la Madrid declared a 3-day mourning period. The government could do little else, since the government at all levels lacked adequate resources and money to fund rescue and recovery efforts. Making matters worse, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced that it would not seek foreign aid and in fact outright rejected offers of official aid from the United States government. In a movement that increased the perception that de la Madrid was out of touch with his priorities, he also decided to continue paying foreign debt rather than use those funds in rescue operations. Political cronyism also soon became apparent as citizens loyal to the PRI received preferential treatment from the government. It was reported that soldiers were pulling machinery out of collapsed factories rather than the bodies of dead workers. The government was also accused of mismanaging its construction contracts, as many of the fallen buildings had been public works projects. Under the weight of its own inability to act and widespread public outcry, the government agreed to allow opposition groups to conduct recovery efforts on their own. On October 2nd, 15,000 people marched in protest, demanding the removal of troops from stricken areas and insisting that non-PRI organizations be allowed to assist in the reconstruction. On October 14th, the government created the PRHP, the Habitat Renovation Program, to oversee reconstruction efforts, but limited its consideration to PRI members. In response, on October 24th, the National Union of Seamstresses was formed. The organization consisted of almost 24 regional popular relief organizations. Within 2 weeks, the number of involved organizations swelled to over 40. On October 26th, over 30,000 people marched to demand a debt moratorium to free up funds for reconstruction and for the removal of the appointed heads of the government's relief agencies. Secretariat of Urban Development and Ecology head Carrillo Arena was replaced by Camacho Solis, who immediately recognized the political validity of the National Union of Seamstresses. If the PRI was facing an erosion of confidence prior to the earthquake, it would see a landslide in its aftershocks. The systematic corruption and weak state capacity that had once been troublesome before became unforgivable with life and death in the balance. After the quake, a multi-party system began to form for the first time. The major leftist parties consolidated. The FDN split from the PRI, and the right-wing PAN continued to gain power. Organized labor gained a voice in reforms, limiting the harm to the working class. The PRI adopted greater transparency in its candidate selection process, and in the 1988 presidential election, the FDN candidate took over 30% of the vote. the PAN was allowed to win the Baja California governor's race. This marked the turning point and end of the single-party system of the past. The country continued to pursue structural adjustments, but in a more measured and policy-driven capacity, opening trade, privatizing industries, and restructuring loans. Local development programs were emphasized, and corrupt union bosses and appointees were eliminated. By 2000, Vicente Fox won the presidential race as a PAN candidate, ending 71 consecutive years of pre-rule.